Alrighty, what's up guys? Today I'm going to share some tips on how to stay up to date even though AI is moving so quickly, and to make sure that our skills are still increasing, which is very important because at the end of the day, it's how much impact we're able to make and what our skills really are, having the relevant skills that help us maintain job security, employability, and all the rest of it, getting pay rises, being able to get a good job we want, and having leverage at work, etc., etc. So what I've been realizing with my job recently is that as AI gets better and better and better, to do the same amount of work that I previously had to do, it requires less and less effort day by day. And on the surface, this is like it's a very big positive, right? Because it means, oh, okay, so instead of having to do 8 hours, now I only need to do 2 hours or something like that. So on the surface, it's a good thing, and I do think it's a good thing, but what happens when let's just say we only do 2 hours instead of the 8 hours, and we're using it, and AI just does the rest? Well, I think there's a risk that over time, for the other people who still do 8 hours and they're using AI intentionally, or they know how to learn and they're continually improving their skills, then what happens is over time, the skills that we had that once made us valuable from a marketplace point of view, they're no longer valuable. And over time, we become less employable, right? But the people who keep upskilling, Đổi mạng rồi. Có mạng không? Có mạng không? All right. My wife was just checking if I was using her hotspot internet or not, because the place we're staying doesn't have very good internet, and then she needs me to get off her internet to get a stable Zoom connection when she's teaching yoga. But anyway, so what was I saying? The people who do know how to learn and do keep up to date, they can adapt very quickly, get up to speed with the relevant skills that are needed. They're going to be able to find a new job even when they get made redundant. They're going to be still valuable from the employer, or even if they're not an official employee, but from the market point of view, from their customers' point of view, because they'll be able to provide value at a reasonable price or at a fair price, because they know how to provide value with modern tools. So that's the flip side of the fact that for now we can relax a lot and we're unburdened by a lot of the work we used to have to do. But if we really need to stay valuable from a marketplace point of view and still need employment, then it's really important that we continue to learn. And well, it's important that we're able to learn effectively, and rather than be complacent, there are a few unfavorable options that we may be faced with if we're complacent, right? The first one is we might just get cut, right? So sooner or later, when the companies find out that, oh, okay, well, if people can do the same amount of work in 2 hours instead of 8, well, then we need less people, right? Or they're going to increase the output or the expectations, and then we need to be ready for that. Otherwise, we won't be able to keep up. So either way, we need to be able to keep up, which pretty much means continual learning, continual upskilling. There's a few factors in there. One is like the intention to do it, recognizing that it's important to do. But the other part is coming up with workflows to do it effectively and efficiently, right? Because, I mean, unfortunately, it's one thing to be motivated, and another thing is you've got to be able to do things effectively, because you could be motivated, but if you can't do it effectively, then the end result that we're trying to achieve is not going to be there anyway. So I think it's a deep rabbit hole, this whole topic. Wasn't planning to go fully deep or comprehensive with it, but I just wanted to share a workflow that I found myself falling into the last few days, which I think has helped me just get my hands dirty with the AI tools, and incorporating into my existing workflows. So I thought that was a really big positive. But then there are different ways I could improve it at all. I'd like to think these examples are useful whether or not you're in software engineering like myself. So hopefully the principles are transferable. So like the first one is, well, we have set ways of doing things and we have habits around which tools we use. So for example, when I do journaling for reflection, I normally use an app like Notion. Well, the point is, yeah, we all have habits around and default ways we're using technology, but one sort of approach or mindset that I've been experimenting with lately is I would notice how when a certain approach has limitations to the way I want to use it, or I can see how it could be better, then that would be my trigger or my prompt to be like, okay, well, I won't use my existing method, or I won't do things exactly the same way I did before, but I might just try and use AI, in my case recently, just to try and vibe code a whole new app, which would have exactly how I would have wanted them, right? Because when you make your own tools, then you can fully customize it. When we're using software that other people have developed, it won't work exactly. It won't be exactly tailored to our needs, and often we just work around it. But if we want to use that as a bit of motivation or as a trigger or as a prompt to get our hands on the tools, then the time invested into building that app, I'd like to think we get that time back, because the app's going to be better and it's going to serve our needs much more directly than the solutions that you can just find online. So that's one thing. It's like when you find yourself thinking, oh, I wish this app had this feature or that feature, or why can't you just have a button to do this or that? Maybe like try to see if that actual functionality does exist in the way you're using it, but if not, see how AI could be used to fill in that gap, whether that be by adopting another tool that you may not have been familiar with, or by even trying to write some code or get AI to generate some code, or even apps. So that's one way of staying in the loop. One disadvantage of that is if you're just telling AI to do stuff, often we're not really sure what it's doing under the hood, or how it's architected things, or how it made design decisions, and if it made the right decisions. So a lot of the time the awareness isn't there, because we're just at the surface level where we're telling it in plain English, I want this, I want that, and it just goes ahead and builds it. But at least in my industry and in my job in software engineering, it pays well to understand architecture, to understand and be able to evaluate architecture, different architectural decisions and trade-offs. Why would you do something this way versus that way? When would you use this way as opposed to that way? And if we're merely just telling the AI to do stuff, it just does it. But we don't necessarily, even if we build something impressive, we're not going to end up with that knowledge. We're not going to have learned that knowledge to the level that's required to be, I guess, to remain an expert or to remain valuable. So to improve that approach that I was just talking about, where we get AI to help make tools that satisfy our requirements, we also need another component of the process that helps us understand the decisions that the AI is making and why they're making it and why it didn't make other decisions, etc., etc. So that's pretty important. I reckon if we could tick those two things, then it's a pretty good start to remaining relevant in the era of AI, right? So the first thing was to use AI to make tools, which is prompted or triggered by recognizing the need for improvement in existing tools, right? But alongside that, it's understanding the process and the decisions and being able to do higher order thinking, which means being able to evaluate different concepts and analyze different concepts and decisions and trade-offs that were made along the way. And there are different ways to do that. Like I feel like the most basic way, which was like one of the most simple ways, which was a way I was using when I first started using ChatGPT a few years ago, was I would try to understand things from a high level first, like what are the different components of this plan, why are they important, how do they relate to each other, and why are we doing things in this way, or what else could we do, and when would it make sense to change the approach, and does this approach make sense if X, Y, Z happens, etc., etc. So that type of thinking is like when we're our mind's in the mode of evaluating and analyzing, and a secret to thinking this way, which I learnt off Justin Sung, who's a learning coach, is that we could immediately, we want to jump to this way of thinking as quick as possible without the need to try and fill out all the details and understand what everything is we don't need to understand everything in a very detailed way to jump to that level of thinking. So if we just want to understand things enough so that we can jump to that level of thinking. And once we start evaluating things from the big picture, we see why they're important, how they relate to each other, then it's only after that, if we need to understand the details and we approach the details then, that they're more likely to stick, because we already have the backbone, we already have the what do you call it? Yeah, we've already sort of scaffolded the topic, understood the landscape, and seen the major components and mapped it out. And so now that we go to the details, we really know where they fit in the big picture. But if you go to the details right away and try to understand everything, if it doesn't fit to a big picture and you're not even sure why it's important and how it's relevant to the whole project kind of thing, then it's not really going to stick. And so it's going to be it's a very ineffective approach to learning, right? So anyway, so the first time when I started using ChatGPT, I would try to go through that process, talk back and forth, test my understanding, ask why things are important, try to understand relationships with ChatGPT, and only then would I start to implement its solution, right? But then these days, because we're working with like harnesses such as Cursor or Windsurf or anti-gravity, whatever, it just gets into the code right away and just starts building stuff at such a rapid speed. And I think you could try and understand everything first, but then these days I find it's so useful to start getting hands-on with the tool and see what it's built, that I try to do both in parallel. And what I mean by that is it still builds a tool according to documents, PIDs, and feature lists that we've brainstormed. But then you can also get it to output markdown documents or documents on the stuff I was just talking about, on architectural decisions, on why things were done a certain way. So you could go back and study them later. So in the first way, I was doing it beforehand, but then these days, I'm getting the AI to output documents so that I can refer to, so I can study later. So you can sort of separate those two components. But yeah, so I think that's very important. One, using AI, and two, sort of understanding why AI is doing what it's doing and being able to evaluate its approach and process. This is specifically, yeah, and I think this applies generally to problem solving in general, but the examples and context that I normally use it in is when I get it to design software. Now, the last thing I wanted to share was, I think it's very important to have reflection habits in general, but there's one reflection habit which I think is very important to continually improving at whatever craft we're doing. And it's a habit where you reflect on your work process and how you did things, and then the challenges that you faced and the inefficiencies and from that, we use that to prime ourselves and reflect on the past, but we use it to come up with experiments for the next time we get back to work. And the reason why this is important is because normally if we just do things a certain way and it gets habituated, then we just do the same thing every day. And then you approach the same work the same way every time you do it. And any improvements to the workflow, it might happen naturally or it might not. Right? So I've seen people naturally improve and they just keep better, but I've also seen people just doing the same thing over and over again, and they still get the work done, but then they're not benefiting from improving the process at all. And so if someone else were approaching the same task, but they're improving every time they do it, then like a month later, 2 months later, it's gonna be such a big gap between the two people, everything else held constant. So one way to ensure that the way we're doing things is improving. So not only are we getting the work done, but then over time we're getting more effective, which makes a huge difference, is to have a reflection habit where we're reflecting on how we did what we did, and what the struggles were at what points, and hypothesizing different experiments to try. Ideally small ones, otherwise it's too overwhelming. And I mean, ideally one at a time, even though you can hypothesize many, but then so you try it next time and then you reflect again. So it's a whole cycle. And what that means is if you keep doing that to something, or you keep applying that reflection to your work, then like compared to someone who doesn't, you end up with, you just end up with a very deliberate workflow, which is optimized by definition, right? So an example of some experiments I was trying recently were like when I was preparing YouTube videos, definitely not for this channel, but for the channel that I'm launching to try, to actually sell online courses for IT for. Like I have like 8 YouTube videos planned, and I reflected on my process of trying to come up with those YouTube ideas and the titles and the thumbnails, etc. And one of the experiments that I tried, which ended up, I think, being very successful, is before I would go through video by video, and I was trying to come up with the title, then the hook, and the thumbnail for each. Then my intention was to do that, then to move to the next video, with my ultimate, with a checkpoint goal of having like 8 videos ready. After doing that for a couple times, I did one of the reflection sessions, and something that came out of that was I realized it was taking so long to do the thumbnails, and like I thought I would have made way more progress in a couple of days kind of thing, but then a lot of the time was taken like obsessing over the thumbnail and trying to design it, everything. So an experiment that I tried was to leave the thumbnails last and do all the titles and just do all the text-based tasks first for all the videos that I was planning. So what I ended up doing was the titles first, and / variations of titles, then the hooks, etc., because that required still a lot of iterating, but you could go in a flow and just do them all. And then now that I'll come back, then I go through the thumbnails, and try to do them sequentially all at once. So it's just an experiment, but I found that one in particular to be pretty, to be pretty effective. And it didn't even have anything to do with AI in this case. It was just more about improving my workflow, making myself more effective and more efficient. Not to say that, and I'm sure if I kept reflecting on that process, it would keep evolving over time. But I guess at the end of the day, you've got to choose what to reflect on. So that's just what I chose to reflect on in that instance. And I think this morning I reflected on, I was also reflecting on the similar process, but I was reflecting on the way that I was reflecting on the way that I had to try build my own app to manage the content creation preparation, because the existing apps I was using were like 80% good, but then I wanted a bit of an improvement, and to be honest, I was like, well, I don't know if it's fully worth it, but it will be if I take into account the experience and the learning I get about related in the process of actually making the new tool. So anyway, that's a bit of a rant. That's pretty much my rant for now. But just to sum it up, to get hands on the tools. When you get hands on the tools and it's designing and solving problems for you, then understand why it's doing the things it's doing, how and what are the components of the proposed architecture and the strategy, how they relate to each other, what are potential trade-offs that were made, that need to be made in the future or that were made now. And as a very meta habit, to continue improving and to make sure you're doing deliberate practice rather than doing the same thing over and over again and not improving over time. Make sure to reflect often on your process, where you may have gone wrong or where you may have struggled or where there may be areas of improvements. Come up with simple experiments and try them and then repeat the cycle. So anyway, that is my rant for today. I do hope it was useful to someone, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side.